Archaeologists have discovered a huge ancient city hidden underground in Mexico, which may give a better understanding of the Maya civilization.
The Maya vanished and left behind only ruins and a story everyone believed. But a DNA test has finally exposed who they really were, and the truth is far darker than anyone imagined. 64 children, sealed in a chamber under the ground.
They die and they revive again every day to remind humans that they got to keep balance, maybe by making offerings and rituals specific to their group.
Every one of them was killed, and for 500 years nobody knew the pattern hidden in their blood. The legend filled the silence with maidens and a sacred well. Then the science spoke instead, and the legend fell apart. What the DNA test found rewrites who these people were, and it points to something still alive today. The wrong story. The Maya reshaped the skulls of their own children. They took newborns in the first days of life while the skull was still soft, and they pressed the head flat between two wooden boards. They bound it tight, and they tightened it again over weeks and months, forcing the growing bone upward into a long, pointed shape that barely looks human. They did this on purpose because to them, a head shaped like that was beautiful. It was a mark of status, a sign of a child born to matter. This is why people see a Maya skull and think of aliens. But the truth is heavier than any alien story because it means these were people willing to reshape a living child's body to fit an idea. And if they would do that to the children they kept, the real question is, what will they did to the children they chose to give away? The answer was buried near a well. And what they did in this well is unbelievable. The well and the accident. At the center of the ancient city of Chichen Itza, in the jungle of southern Mexico, there is a giant sinkhole filled with dark water. The Maya believed holes like this were doorways into the underworld. This one had a name. They called it the Well of Sacrifice. When the rains failed and the crops died and the people began to starve, the Maya brought their most precious offering to the edge of that well and threw it in alive, to beg the rain god to come back. And the offering, the legend always said, was a young girl, a beautiful maiden. For 100 years, that story seemed to have proof. In the early 1900s, an American named Edward Thompson bought the whole ruined city and became obsessed with the well. He dredged the bottom. He even had himself lowered into the black water in a diving suit to feel along the floor with his hands. He pulled up gold. He pulled up jade. He pulled up carved offerings and the bones of the dead. Hundreds of objects thrown into that water over hundreds of years. And he pulled up human remains. Enough to convince the world the legend was true. But there was a crack in the story that nobody wanted to look at, because even then, when they actually examined the bones that came out of that well, many of them did not belong to young women at all. Some were men, many were children. The maidens of the legend were mostly not there. The legend held anyway because it was a better story. A beautiful girl thrown to her death cells. A pit full of murdered children does not. So the world kept the version it preferred, and the truth stayed at the bottom of the water for 60 more years. Until a crew building a small airport runway, only a few hundred steps from that famous well, drove their machines into the ground and broke open something nobody had been looking for. A second chamber, hidden, sealed, and full of children. The Chamber of Children. It was a cholton, an underground chamber the Maya normally carved out to store water. But this one had been connected to a small natural cave, and this one had never held water. Inside it were the bones of 64 children. And the way they were laid mattered, because this was nothing like throwing a body into a well in a panic. These children had been placed, arranged. The chamber had been opened and used again and again for more than 500 years. So this was not one terrible night. It was a tradition. Something the Maya did on purpose, generation after generation, in the same hidden room. And the ages are the part that sits wrong in your chest. About half of them were between 3 and 6 years old. Toddlers. Not one of them had lived long enough to grow up. These were not warriors taken in battle, not criminals being punished. They were small children, gathered across centuries, laid in a sealed room beside a doorway, the Maya believed opened straight into the world of the dead. Think about what that room actually was. A pit cut into limestone, sealed off from the light, opened only when there was another child to add. A place a parent would have known about. A place a child in their last hours may have been carried toward through the city, past the Great Pyramid, down into the dark. And whoever did this kept doing it. Not for a year, not for a generation, for 5 centuries. That is 20 generations of Maya adults who looked at this practice, understood exactly what it was, and chose to continue it with their own sons. And for decades after the chamber was found, those bones would not talk. The skeleton of a young child gives almost nothing away. The bones are soft, half-formed, and they all look alike. You cannot read a name in them. You cannot read a face. You cannot even reliably tell a boy from a girl, because the features that separate the sexes have not grown in yet. So the chamber kept its secret for half a century. The children sat in storage, numbered, studied, and silent, and every question anyone asked of them came back blank, until the technology caught up. A team took the most damaged, most silent remains in the collection, and they pulled ancient DNA out of the bone, and they read it. And the very first thing the DNA said broke the oldest story in half. The first shock. Every single one of them was a boy, not a mix, not mostly, not roughly half the way you would expect if children were taken at random. 64 out of 64. Every child in that chamber was male, the story everyone grew up with. The maidens, the virgins, the girls thrown to the well, it did not just bend, it collapsed. Because the real victims at the heart of this place were little boys, some barely old enough to walk. And that opened a much harder question. Because if you are choosing only boys, deliberately for 500 years, then this was never panic in a drought. This was a rule. Someone was selecting these children on purpose. So where do you even get 64 boys for something like this? The old Spanish records describe how children were taken for sacrifice, and the answer is its own quiet horror. They were bought, they were traded for, and some were simply taken. But the boys in this chamber were different, because when the scientists looked closer at their DNA, they were not a random collection of boys gathered from across the Maya world at all. Many of the children in that chamber shared blood, brothers, close family drawn again and again from the same family lines. Somewhere in that city, there were Maya parents who gave up not one child to that dark room, but 2 or more from the same household. But the DNA was still not finished, and the last thing it found is the detail that changes the meaning of everything. Among those related boys were 2 pairs of identical twins. Identical twins are rare. They happen by chance about once in every 250 births anywhere on Earth. So finding 2 separate sets of them inside one small group of sacrificed boys does not happen by accident. The Maya were not just picking boys. They were not just picking brothers. They were hunting for twins and placing them in that chamber on purpose. And to understand why people would go looking for twin boys to send into the underworld, you have to know the one story the Maya told above all others. Because they did not think of it as a story. They thought they were living inside it. And it begins with 2 brothers walking down into the land of the dead. The Hero Twins. The Maya spoke of 2 brothers, summoned down into the underworld by the lords of death to be destroyed. The Maya called that place Xibalba, and it was built to break them. A house full of knives that moved on their own. A house of cold that froze a body solid. A house of starving jaguars. A house of fire. In one version of their story, one brother has his head cut off and hung in a tree. But the twins do not die. That is the whole point. They beat the lords of death at their own games, they climb back out of the dark, and they rise into the sky as the sun and the moon, down into death, then back into the light. To the Maya, that was not a fairy tale. It was how the world worked. The sun dies every night and comes back every morning. The crops die in the dry season and come back with the rain. Everything that lives has to go down into death first and claw its way back. And this is what they believe, that twins are not children, they are the gods who go down and return. That is why they stack twins in a room beside the hole. These children were not being thrown away in grief. They were being sent on purpose with a job, to walk into death and force the world to live again, to go through the door, beat the lords of the underworld, and come back up dragging the sunrise behind them. Except a 3-year-old cannot beat the lords of death. A 3-year-old cannot outsmart anything. These children only ever played the first half of the story. They went down into the dark, but no one ever wrote the part where they came back. And if you think the horror ends there, with old bones and an old story sealed in a room, you are not going to believe the rituals. The doorway. Let's go back to the chamber for a moment, because the scientists noticed something about the room itself that does not fit a normal grave. The Chultan was not sealed off on its own. It was connected by a narrow passage to a small natural cave that ran deeper into the rock. The children were not buried at the bottom of a pit. They were laid at the mouth of an opening that went down into the earth. To us, that is geology. A cave is a cave. But to the Maya, it was the single most sacred and most terrifying kind of place there is. A cave was not a hole in the ground. It was a door, a real physical entrance into the underworld, the same world the hero twins walked into. The Maya went into caves to leave offerings, to pray, to speak to the dead, because they believed the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest there. A cave mouth was the closest a living person could stand to the other side without crossing over. So the boys were not placed in the ground. They were placed at the threshold, lined up at the door, where the Maya believed the world of the dead actually began. And that reframes everything the DNA had found. The shaped skulls that marked them out from birth, the careful choosing of brothers and twins, the 500 years of the same ritual in the same room beside the same cave. None of it was random cruelty. It was a system built around one belief, that if you sent the right children marked the right way, chosen by the right blood, through the right door, they could do down there what the gods had done. These children were equipment, tools shaped from birth for one purpose, and the purpose was to be pushed through a door that only opened one way. Which leaves only one question. Where does a person even learn to believe something like that? The living scar. The team did one more test, and it dragged this whole story out of the ancient past and into right now. They took DNA from people living in a small town near Chichen Itza today, a community still farming the same land, and they held it up against the children in the chamber. The match was unmistakable. The people working those fields today are the direct descendants of the same population those sacrificed boys came from. The blood that ran in that dark room never ended. It thinned, it spread, it carried on through 100 generations. And it is still here, walking the Yucatan, raising families, going to market, with a line running straight back to the boys sent into the underworld. But the comparison turned up one last thing, and it is a horror of a different kind. The DNA showed a change in the immune systems of the people alive today, a set of genes switched on that the ancient Maya did not carry. Genes that defend the body against salmonella, the bacteria behind a killing fever. The children in the chamber had no such protection. Their descendants do. And the reason is one of the worst things that ever happened to these people. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they brought diseases the Maya had never met, and the sickness tore through them. In one wave of epidemics, it is believed a huge part of the entire population of Mexico was wiped out. Whole towns emptied. Families ended in a matter of weeks. The only ones who lived were the people whose bodies, by sheer genetic luck, could fight the fever off. They passed that defense down to their children, and their children passed it down again, all the way to the people living beside Chichen Itza today. Which means every Maya person in that region now carries, hidden inside their cells, the mark of a catastrophe 5 centuries gone. Their own bodies are a record of the plague that nearly erased them. The dead are not only in the chamber, the dead are in the blood of the living. Every person in that town carries them, whether they know it or not. And that unbroken line is where the real horror finally shows itself. The true origin. The DNA did not just prove the modern Maya descended from the sacrifices, it proved the bloodline runs deeper than the city itself. When the scientists read the deepest layers of the twins' code, The part that reaches furthest back in time, they found a faint thread that did not belong. A trace that did not come from the Maya and did not come from anyone native to that land at all. A signature that pointed somewhere far away. To contact that, by every accepted timeline, should have been impossible. And the moment you see that trace, a much larger pattern snaps into focus. Because the Maya were not the only people on Earth telling this story. Across the ancient world, cultures that never met, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all wrote down the same memory. Beings who came down from the sky. Teachers. They came to the Earth, handed people knowledge they had no business having, how to farm, how to write, how to read the movements of the stars, and then they went back to wherever they came from, promising to return. The same story, told over and over by people who could not possibly have shared it. And here, in the blood of 2 sacrificed boys in a Mexican cave, was a genetic thread quietly tying the Maya into that same web. The same impossible idea carried not just in story, but in the body. The Maya twin gods, the brothers who go down into death and climb back into the sky, were not a fairy tale the Maya invented. They were a memory of teachers who came, gave knowledge, and left, promising to return. And the children in that chamber were not offerings begging the rain to fall. They were messengers, sent down through the door, marked and chosen and bred for it, to carry a message into the dark and bring the teachers back, waiting for something that came once, taught them everything they knew, and promised to come again. And for 500 years, in the same sealed room, they kept sending their own children down to call it home. And the trace did not die with them. The same faint signature the scientist found in the twins is still out there, in the people farming beside Chichen Itza this very morning, carried by descendants who have no idea what is written in their blood or who put it there. The bones in that room were never the end of the story. They were only the part that got buried. The rest of it woke up this morning, went to work, and has no idea what it carries. So here is the question. If the Maya kept sending children down to bring the teachers back, then they believed for 500 years that someone was still listening. Do you think they were wrong? Or do you think the teachers were always meant to return? Tell us what you think in the comments.